Hey guys, welcome back. Alright, so I was watching this and thinking of a way that I could apply it, and it kept screaming out to me as I watched it that everybody who is a hard left, you're a radical left-leaning Democrat, liberal, you're all agoraphobic, and in this really interesting way that you have a fear of your surroundings. Here, before we go on, let's agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is an anxiety disorder characterized by symptoms of anxiety in situations where the person perceives their environment to be unsafe with no easy way to escape. So, years ago, I always thought agoraphobia was just a fear of large spaces, but that's not true. It's just your environment in general, right? So, let's listen to Jordan Peterson talk about how to get over this, and we'll start talking about how this applies to the radical left.
How do you deal with tragedy and malevolence? And you can say, well, I'm not prepared. It's like, yeah, fair enough. Unsurprising, especially if you were overprotected as a child. It's not a good idea to overprotect your kids because the snakes are going to come into the garden no matter what you do.
Okay, so let's stop real quick, right? The protection that we're going to use in the reference is the protection that the Democrats give you an idea of, right? That's the protection. So because the Democrats are constantly telling you that they're going to take care of you and that they're going to give you all the things that they need as long as you vote for them, you have been overprotected and you are not ready to deal with the actual realities of the world and the fact of so much that if you are a criminal and you commit a criminal act, there is a chance that you're going to be shot by the police and that it doesn't have anything to do with your skin color.
And so then you, instead of trying to keep the damn snakes away, what you do is you arm your child with something that can help them chop them into pieces and make the world out of them. So that the trick for human thriving in the face of suffering and malevolence is strength, not protection. It's a completely different idea. We also know this clinically. We know, for example, that if you treat people with exposure therapy for agoraphobia, which is, roughly speaking, the fear of chaos, I would say, the fear of everything, you don't make them less afraid. You make them braver.
So, how interesting would it be if parents, especially parents in the black community, sat down and started teaching their kids something different besides the rhetoric that you hear on the mainstream media, which is that the police are racist? Why don't you sit them down and say, look, this is what the police do. This is the things that they have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, because that way the child will actually have exposure therapy to what the cops actually have to do instead of just being protected by saying, oh, the police are bad, you should have never trust them.
It's not the same thing. Because with an agoraphobic, see, what happens to them is the fall. They never conceptualize death and suffering. They're naive, right? It never enters the theater of their imagination, and it's because they're protected from it. But then something happens. This often happens to women in their 40s, because they're the people most likely to develop agoraphobia. Something happens. They've been protected from chaos by authority their entire life. So maybe they had an overprotective father, and then they went to an overprotective boyfriend, and then they went.
In this case, it doesn't necessarily translate to the left, but if you think about it, you have your parents the whole time telling you a certain agenda, and then you grow up and you have university telling you a certain agenda, and you have the media constantly telling you a certain agenda, a certain narrative, without actually ever looking into it or realizing that those things aren't really what's happening. That's not the framework that the world is actually functioning in.
To an overprotective husband. And maybe they were willing to be subjugated to all three of those because of the protection, right? So that's the bargain. They stay weak and dependent, and maybe they have to because that's the only way they can appeal to the person who's hyperprotective. But the price.
So think about this. You become dependent and you are subjugated by the people that you are that you're listening to. The left has you so brainwashed that you are willing to just eat the narrative, hook, line, and sinker of whatever they have. to sit there and keep yourself thinking, oh, well, they're going to make sure that these things that I'm worried about don't happen to me, even though those things don't actually
they
happen,
pay for
not the
that
way
is
you
that they're
say they
not
do.
sufficiently competent. And then something happens in their life, often in their 40s, they develop heart palpitations, maybe as a consequence of menopause. Their heart starts to beat erratically and they think, oh no, death. It's like, well, who are you going to talk to about that? Right? There's no protection from authority for that. Or maybe their friend gets divorced, or maybe their sister dies, or something like that. It brings up the specter of mortality, and maybe the specter of malevolence and mortality, and it brings it up in a way that authority, recourse to authority, cannot solve. And so then they have panic attacks. What happens? They go out, they get afraid, they feel their heart beating, then they get afraid of their heart beating because they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and they think, oh no, I'm going to die, and I'm going to make a fool of myself while I'm doing it and attract a lot of attention. So the two big fears come up: mortality and social judgment. And then they have a panic attack. It's like fight or flight's gone out of control. Very, very unpleasant. Then they start to avoid the places they've had a panic attack. Then they end up not being able to go anywhere. So then Tiamat has come back, right? A huge monster, a little victim. And so what do you do with them?
So how conceivable is it that the radical liberals, the far left, that they're actually acting out in a certain way because they have this their own self-imposed fear of what's being done to them, right? They sit there and they see a thing, and because they feel a certain way when they see that thing or when a certain action happens, that thing becomes a negative, right? A police officer does his job and detains a criminal, and that criminal ends up dead because of that criminal's choices. And instead of looking at it the way that it actually happens, the way you perceive it is that that's a negative, and so then you have a negative view of those things every time they happen, and it constantly puts you where you feel everywhere you go those negative things are going to happen. And so you get to the point where you've made yourself delusional, where you think that the only choice, the only recourse that you have is to loot and riot and burn.
Well, there's no saying, no, there's no Tiamat. That's done, right? Their naivety is over. They've had a direct contact with the threat of mortality and social judgment. They've met the terrible mother and they've met the terrible father. And there's no going back. There's no saying, oh, the world is safe. It's not safe. Not at all. It's not safe. The fact that you think it's safe means that you were living in an unconscious bubble that was sort of provided to you by your culture. It's a gift. And now that's been shattered.
Think about what he just said. If you think the world is safe, you have been living in an unconscious bubble. So let me take it a step further. If you think that you are going to be able to make the world safe, you are still living in an unconscious bubble.
And so now what do you do? Well, the answer is you retreat until you're in your house and there's nowhere you can go. You're the ultimate frozen rabbit, right? And your life is hell because you can't function. The alternative is, let's take apart the things you're afraid of. Let's expose you to them, carefully and programmatically. And then you'll learn that you're actually tougher than you think. You never knew that. And maybe you didn't want to take on the responsibility because, people play a role in their own demise, so to speak. When you had opportunity to go out and explore or withdraw because you were afraid, you chose to withdraw because you were afraid.
You live in America. If you're watching this and you live in America, you live in the country with the greatest opportunities, the highest abundance of opportunities. And if you feel that you are somehow oppressed for any reason, I would hazard a guess that it's most likely because you chose to be oppressed, not because anybody's actually oppressing you.
So it's not only that you were overprotected often, it's that you were willing to take advantage of the fact that you were overprotected and run back there whenever you had the opportunity.
All right, here comes some really good stuff.
So then you take people out, you say, well, what are you afraid of? Rank it from 1 to 10. So 10 is, make a list of 10 things you're afraid of. The thing you're least afraid of we'll call number 10. So we'll start with that. Okay, well, I'm afraid of elevators.
Let's call
Okay,
it
well,
police
let's
brutality.
look at a picture of an elevator.
Why don't
Let's
you
have
go
you
out for a
imagine
ride along, or go
being in
see
an
what it's
elevator.
like
Let's
to
go out to an elevator and let you
go
watch
on a
the terrible
911
jaws
call?
of death open, because that's how you're responding to it symbolically, right? And you're going to do that at the closest proximity you can manage. You find out, you go do that, it works. You're nervous as hell, especially from an anticipatory perspective. Shaking. You go out, you stop, you watch it happen, and you actually calm down. You do that 10 times and it no longer bothers you. Well, what you've learned that you didn't die. But more importantly than that, you've learned that you could withstand the threat of death. That's what you've learned. And then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer, and then you move a little closer.
So it's almost like he's saying that if you go out and you face your fears, you're not going to be afraid of those things that you were afraid of, right? Going into an elevator because you're worried about an enclosed space or it falling or anything like that. When you go in and it doesn't kill you, you realize, oh well, okay, I can face it. I can know that it's still going to kill me, and I can get in and I can deal with that idea. If you're worried about police brutality, why don't you go and see what the cops have to deal with on a day-to-day basis? It would give you some perspective into what they're doing and why they react the way that they do, and then you wouldn't be so ignorant into what's going on, and you wouldn't be afraid of a cop interaction.
And finally, you're back in what's no longer the elevator from a symbolic perspective. It's a tomb, right? It's a place of enclosure and isolation. And you learn, turns out I can withstand that. And then you're much more together, much more confident. And that's often one of the things that often happens in situations like that. I've seen this multiple times, is that if you run someone through an exposure training process like that and toughen them up, they'll often start standing up to people around them in a way they never did before, because they wouldn't stand up for themselves before, because they weren't willing to undermine the protection. See, if you're protecting me, I can't bother you, because I can't afford to forsake your protection. So if I'm going to play that game, I'm going to hide behind you, then I can't challenge you. So that's no good, because that's sometimes why people, you see this with guys very frequently, they're still deathly afraid of their father's judgment when they're in their 30s or 40s. It's like, well, why? Because they still want to believe that there's someone out there that knows. And so they're willing to accept the subjugation, because it doesn't force them to challenge the idea that there's someone out there that knows. Because that's the advantage of having your father as a judge, right? Because he knows. Well, what if he doesn't? What if no one knows any better than you? Well, that's a rough thing. You don't, until you realize that, you're not an adult, right? That's really technically the point of realization of adulthood, is that no one actually knows what you should do more than you do. I mean, it's a horrible realization, because what the hell do you know? It's a terrible realization, and people will often pick slavery, permanent slavery, to the spirit of the Great Father, let's say, over that realization, and it's completely understandable. But the problem with it is that there's more to you than you think, and so if you continue to hide behind that figure, then you never have a chance to understand that there's more to you than you think, far more to you than you think.
So you're willingly subjugating yourself. You're willingly becoming a slave by relying on other people telling you what is best for you, by not having uh, enough realization of what you need, what you want, and enough drive to go out there and get it. It's so odd that I watched this and I was like, oh, this strikes me as every left person. There's no responsibility. There's a dependence on other people. Think about it like this: socialism. I want free health care and free education and free housing and free income and blah 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 blah. For what? What did you do to earn it? You want to be protected by somebody. You want to be subjugated. And that's not what I want. I don't know about the rest of you, but I do not feel like being a slave. And for all the people out there that are black that talk about how bad slavery it is, it's really funny that you follow the left and the Democrats, because that's exactly what they're turning you into. Just food for thought, guys. We'll see you in the next one.